It's reported that 1 in 2 parents caring for a medically complex child suffers from increased depression, anxiety, or some other mental health challenge. Quite frankly, I'm shocked that that's not 100% every parent. As a parent that experienced that with my child who was diagnosed as autistic as an infant, he was basically nearing 2 years old when he got the official diagnosis. I know what my journey has been getting my head around and heart around what we were going to face and what he was going to face, what kind of life he was going to face. And I know Christy has her own journey that she'll share as she experienced, Mickie and her diagnosis at 3 months old and having her baby have surgery one day before she turned a year old. Then all of that has happened since. And we're so honored to have this conversation, to facilitate this conversation, and to really elevate the attention and almost in a way give permission for parents to be okay with acknowledging that mental health struggles do exist. And as human beings, there are already enough, mental health challenges that we go through during different of our life, alone caring for a medically complex child and having to worry about what your son or daughter's future might look like. Had to grieve loss of what you expected. Having to go to bed at night wondering if your child is going to wake up in the morning. These are very real issues that we hear from the parents that we get to advocate for at Mickie's Miracles. And Mickie's Miracles, for those of you who don't know us, we're primarily a global pediatric epilepsy advocacy organization. We advocate for parents and their children to get into level 4 epilepsy centers as urgently as possible for the correct diagnosis and treatment. But we also know that the diagnosis and treatment is just the beginning of the journey. And that journey goes through ups and downs. It goes through scares. It goes through optimism. It goes through bouts of grief and everything in between. And we recognize that it was our responsibility to really bring this conversation forth so that we can really help parents develop additional tools beyond what they have already to cope with whatever mental health challenges they might be experiencing. With that, I'd like to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Dario Herrera. I am with Mickie's Miracles, and I'd like to introduce our CEO and visionary founder, Christy Greaves. Christy.
Thank you for that introduction, Dario. I agree with everything you just said, and I am so grateful that we are finally having this conversation that was born from the feedback of families and my own personal experience, 10 years in the journey with epilepsy and rare disease, and just this August experienced PTSD after a long-term monitoring stay and some unexpected news that we got on Michaela, and was taken back that once again, this was something that I was facing, and really came to the honest realization that this is something that's never going to end. Just like our journey with epilepsy, we will always be monitoring Michaela's brain for epilepsy. And we get to monitor not only our children for their mental health, but ourselves. And I have found it very easy as a mother and wife to put everybody first and to take care. It's very easy for me and natural for me to take care of Michaela and her needs. But what is not natural is to acknowledge and recognize that there are mental health challenges there that need to be addressed, and that I always will need to add tools in my tool belt on learning how to deal with those challenges as they come across. And so this program, I'm so honored to say, is the brainchild of our medical advisory board that makes up some of the best pediatric epileptologists, neurologists, mental health professionals in the country. And as well as in partnership with Jazz Pharmaceuticals and Neurelis, who have underwritten this program, acknowledging that this is a need of our community that must be addressed. It is urgent, just like epilepsy is urgent. And I am honored that you are all here, because it's really your feedback that creates the programming that we provide our warrior families. So it's really due to you and to the feedback our providers have received and we have received at Mickie's Miracles, that we need to have something in place to care for our caregivers, because they are the ones that are 24/7, as you said, nonstop, wondering, is my child going to wake up at night? Wondering, how are we going to take care of this diagnosis? What is the best medications? What are the best providers? And so therefore, we are here tonight, and I am just so honored that Dr. Janelle Wagner will be leading us in Caring for Caregivers Mental Health Program with Mickie's Miracles.
Thank you, Christy. And I have to say, I've learned so much by observing you and Gabe and how you both have navigated, the journey. And I've seen seasons where you're up and he's maybe different, or vice versa. And the fact that you guys have a team and have brought a team approach to this. And interestingly, we've been working together for almost 4 years now, which
wow,
it's kind of crazy. It's been almost 4 years. But really only in the last year have we started talking really in depth, since the Pediatric Epilepsy podcast, our first episode with Dr. Wagner, where she really dove into, mental health for not just the children, but for the parents of the children that we advocate for, that you've really opened up about your journey. And I think, as people get to hear, not just you, but Dr. Wagner, myself, another parent sharing, I think there's a lot of power in that.
Yeah.
And it creates this community where we can really rely on one another for support. And I know that's something we do at Mickie's. We really extend beyond the diagnosis and really, support our families, whether it's financially or emotionally or by connecting them to a community beyond themselves. And that's an important part of what we do, but this program is open to all care providers.
That's right.
Beyond caregivers, beyond epilepsy. So all parents are welcome.
Yes.
This series will be ongoing. We'll have basically meetings every 2 weeks. And before we get into introducing the magnificent Dr. Wagner, magnificent and talented Dr. Wagner, I just want to kind of go through the highlight of the program. And for tonight's conversation, we'll have initial presentation from Dr. Wagner. And then we're going to have a moment where we're going to have a practical exercise that I don't want to give away, but I promise it'll be worth the wait. And then we'll get to questions and answers and at the third part of the program. And what we'll do, and I'll ask parents to do that now. And of course, the chat will be open the way through the conversation. But if you have a specific question as it relates to mental health care for yourself, or you want some type of thing to be addressed, please post your question in the chat. Obviously, Dr. Wagner won't be able to give specific mental health advice. This is not in place of therapy. This does not replace you having your relationship with your own mental health community and the professionals, but really just designed to provide permission for all of us to acknowledge it, talk about it, remove any stigma, judgment, shame around it, and to provide and connect you to additional resources along this journey that we all share together. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Wagner. She is a member of our medical advisory board and deserves a lot of credit for planting the seed with us over a year ago, and for being essential in planning, and facilitating how these conversations are going to take place. She's an associate professor of research at the Medical University of South Carolina. She's also a faculty member at MUSC's Comprehensive Program for Epilepsy. She got her master's and her PhD at Oklahoma State. And she's a tireless advocate for the importance of having mental health be part of the comprehensive continuum of care for not just our children, but for parents of our children as well. With that, Dr. Wagner, thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Dario and Christy for inviting me to be part of this really important conversation. And so I will just add one more piece to the part where you get to know me a little bit, so you know my background. So yes, I am a pediatric psychologist, but I am also a sister of a brother who had epilepsy, was diagnosed when he was 10, and the daughter of two parents that I watched navigate. I was 13 when my brother was diagnosed, so watched them navigate that and learned a lot from them, knew that I wanted to work in epilepsy when I grew up. So here we are, and I'm just so grateful that we're able to have this conversation. So I want to just kick it off by doing something that you might not be expecting. The first thing I want to say is there's a really great quote by John Bowlby, who was an attachment researcher in psychology. And he said, if we value our children, then we must cherish their parents. And so for many years in psychology, we have understood the close connection between parents and children, and that children's outcomes and functioning are very closely related to caregivers functioning and vice versa. So it's a really important space for us to be able to talk about you. So what I wanted to ask you is just take 30 seconds here to think about, what are your strengths? So what are you good at? And this could be defined many ways. What are you good at as a caregiver? What are you good at in your vocation or place of employment? What are you good at as a spouse? Just what are your strengths? And you could think about this in terms of personal characteristics. So if you feel like you're a fairly resilient person, or if you feel that you have strong problem-solving skills, or perhaps are a good leader, maybe you're really resourceful. I have found over the years that parents of kids with epilepsy are extremely resourceful. And then what are your strengths in terms of the choices that you make? And one of those to think about is, how much time do you set aside for yourself? And you're probably thinking, that's a really crazy question to know. I don't have any time for myself. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today. So I'll just pause, let you think about that for a few more seconds, and then we can kind of dive right into talking about grief. And before we talk about grief, I do want to acknowledge that coming into this space may be hard for some people, right? I mean, you've taken a great first step. You've joined the call. You are interested in hearing the discussion about grief. But when we get to these places where we start to talk about emotions and we talk about hard subjects like grief, caregiver burden, sometimes that's a lot for families. And so appreciate you joining the call, but just want to validate the fact that it can be really hard to come into this space, to focus, to concentrate, maybe because you have little people in the background. Even if the little people aren't physically in the background, generally they might be in the background of our minds, things that you're thinking about. I also want to acknowledge the fact that has been a lot of mental burden on families with COVID. So that has created additional challenges for people, and some of that burden remains, either because it's ongoing challenge or because there was just so much burden on your family during COVID that you're kind of still digging yourself out of that. And then it can be difficult to access emotions too, right? So talking about these things is actually tiring. So don't be surprised after these meetings if you're like, why do I feel so exhausted? One, we might be using a part of your brain that you're not used to accessing. And two, it's hard to talk about these things and to acknowledge that. So I just want to kind of lay that out there, and hopefully we'll keep coming back to this throughout the series, because that's the whole reason we're here, is to acknowledge challenges and strengths, and then to give you some tips moving forward on some of those things. So grief. I titled, today's call, Navigating the Storm, because I think the storm is a really good analogy to think about grief. So as in psychology, we define grief as a strong, overwhelming emotion when we've lost someone or something, right? So you could lose a child, or you could lose dreams for your child, dreams for yourself. And so grief can take on many different hats. And when we think about grief, sometimes we think about the extreme sadness that can come with that, but there are so many aspects to grief, and it's not a linear journey. It's not that you start here and you end up down the road. For some people, it's a cycle. For others, they move very slowly through certain aspects of grief and then really quickly through others. So it's very much a universal and a personal experience, because it is a natural reaction to loss. And when you experience grief, it's because something that is very important to you has been lost. So it actually, in some ways, because it is a very natural response, it emphasizes how much you loved what you lost, whether that is a person or a thing, as I mentioned. And each person's journey is different, and we don't really control the process. So I hear people sometimes saying, all I've got to do is this. And it's like, well, to some degree, yes, there are coping skills and things that you can use, but there are a lot of these things that are outside of our control, like losing the thing that we loved. Right? For many of us, those things happen outside of our control too. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came up with different stages for grief. And I'm not going to walk through those specifically today, but just acknowledge the fact that, it's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So the idea being that at any given time, you might be in any of these different stages. And again, don't have to go through them in that order. Sometimes it's a cycle, and sometimes we take one step forward and then we take 2 steps back. And that's okay too. So part of what, as mental health, when we look at grief, we're looking to see how long has it been going on? Is it specific to one thing? Are there multiple things involved? Is depression involved? Because sometimes we want to think about, well, depression can be related to grief, but actually we might treat depression differently because that is a mental health disorder. Grief is not. Grief is an experience that can lead to depression, but we also want to look at kind of the time frame of everything and acknowledge that everyone experiences grief. Not everyone experiences depression. And so back to my example of navigating the storm. If you think about a storm, some are big, some are small, some come on very quickly when we're least expecting it, and others, at least where I live, you have hurricanes and tornadoes, and we know about those days in advance, and we're planning for those. And grief is somewhat like that too, because people will think about an anniversary or a certain time of the year, and they'll be expecting to feel the grief and the sadness. But sometimes you're in your car and a song comes on, or you're in the grocery store and picking out a food item, and that may start some grief for you as well. So in these storms too, sometimes it's a downpour, right? I mean, you literally feel like it's all you can do to keep yourself above water. Sometimes it's a light sprinkle of rain too with a storm. Sometimes there's lightning, so again, the idea that it can come and go, it can come when we expect it, when we don't expect it. There are different levels of severity and how much we feel at a particular time. And then also, same as in the storm, sometimes there's a rainbow or there's a lapse in the rain. And so we can actually feel calm and we can feel grief at the same time. We can feel joy and we can feel grief at the same time. We can also appreciate that grief can go away, but then it can also come back as a new storm. And if you think about it, epilepsy is a lot like this too, because there's so much uncertainty with it. You could have a seizure today. You could not have a seizure for an entire year. And so families with epilepsy deal with a lot of uncertainty, whether it's the seizures, whether it's grief, whether it's knowing what to expect long-term versus short-term. And so I really do want to emphasize that, because as human beings, uncertainty is very difficult for us. It doesn't feel good because we don't know what to expect. And many times we don't have a lot of control over the circumstances or the situation. And so a lot of times for families, when you're early in an epilepsy diagnosis, there's a lot of shock and denial and searching for information. And for people who've been on this journey for a while and their child has chronic epilepsy, you start to perhaps experience a loss of hopes and dreams for the child, or a loss of hopes and dreams for your family, in recognizing that this is kind of what you expect the short term as well as the long term to look like. And so, is there a best way to experience grief or to respond to grief? No. Other than to find the coping skills that work for you, to find the people who can be supportive to you and to connect to them in that. And there's a couple papers that in the research in epilepsy that have looked at caregivers. And one of them was actually by a colleague of mine at MUSC. And the biggest theme that came out of her focus group study was navigating the non-contingencies of epilepsy was the biggest challenge for caregivers, and that there were very different needs within the first year compared to 5 years post-diagnosis. Joan Austin has also done some work similar to this as well, looking at caregiver needs. And what she shows is that they are highest at 3 months post-diagnosis, but these worries and concerns and that need for information is still there at 24 months. Now, they didn't assess past 24 months in this study, but those of you who've been on this journey for years know that a lot of those things can still be there. And so one of the things that Christy and Dario and I discussed last week when we were talking about this call is thinking about, again, we're not able to provide mental health advice in the sense of like individualized, but what can we do to help ensure or promote hope? And one of the things is exactly what we're doing with this call, and all of you being on here today is connecting with others. So sharing your story with others and bringing it into the light takes it out of that isolation and that feeling that I'm the only one who's going through this. Because more than likely, there's another caregiver who has a very similar experience to you. And I apologize for this noise in the background. My husband left his phone in here and it keeps dinging. So I'm sorry. I'm going to try to turn it off here. There we go. Okay. And so one of the things that we want to do is give you all a chance to share in the chat today and try to provide that connection, not just to the speakers, but to each other when you're on these calls as well. So connecting with others is super important. And out of that comes validation, as I mentioned, just hearing others' experience and seeing other people go through that. And it can also give you a purpose as a caregiver in sharing your journey. Sometimes caregivers feel like, oh, nobody else kind of has the same experience, or I don't really have anything to add. And like I said before, I find that caregivers of parents with epilepsy, first of all, you are my heroes because of all of the things that you navigate and go through and the way that you advocate for your kids. But what your story has a lot of power in it when you share, because it validates for others. It gives others hope. And those of you that further along in your journey sometimes have some really great tidbits or things that you can share to those that are coming along earlier in their journey or still in that kind of shock and denial phase. So we did want to say tonight too, that we really want to encourage that if you are needing help and you think more help than what we're providing on these calls by connecting you and by having experts come in and talk about different things and giving you a chance to share in the chat, is that we are absolutely would like to help you advocate for mental health provider for yourself. So if you have concerns about that, please, you can direct message Dario in the chat, and, we can look into trying to help you find those services. Because taking care of you really is a priority. And on those days when you feel like, I can't take time for myself today because I need to do X, Y, Z, please remember that when you take care of yourself, it makes doing X, Y, Z easier for you, as well as makes your response to others generally a more healthy interaction because you've had that time to take care of yourself. So we also have a couple of sites that are starting to really get some good resources on them, and we will be able to share those with you too. I know there's one that the American Psychological Association Pediatric Psychologist has a special interest group that's devoted just to caregivers. So there's some podcasts and some resources that are available for you on that website. But what we'd like to do now is take some time to take a few minutes and ask you to share in the chat. Please share something that has worked for you or one of your strengths when you have been feeling down or feeling a lot of grief. Or it could be a daily thing that you do for yourself to give yourself that personal space to kind of take care of you. So we'd like to invite you to share that in the chat now, because we feel like you all are the one in the trenches, and what you're doing and what's helping you could be really helpful to someone else who might be stuck. And I'm going to try to pull up. There we go. I see you all have put some great questions in. Oh, I see. Okay. So Brittany says a cup of coffee alone. That's great. Christy says yoga, connecting with other epilepsy parents. Colleen. Earl says Bible journaling is a creative outlet for me. And Dario says, what has helped me is to talk to other parents who've experienced autism with their own children. Oh, sorry. It's Chelsea, not Earl, who does Bible journaling. Want to make sure I get that right. And Claire says, connecting with parents through social media has been really beneficial to me. All right, great. Well, thank you to those of you who shared those. And I see, there's a wide range here. There's, meditation and exercise through yoga. I noticed the alone happening a lot, right? So cup of coffee alone, I'm assuming Bible journaling is probably alone. So getting that alone time. Kara says getting up before the kids and having quiet time before the day starts. So yes, finding those few minutes, and 5 minutes might not seem like much, but it can actually be a huge help to you, especially if you have that 5 minutes. And, whatever you feel like can be helpful to you, whether that is journaling or reading or having that cup of coffee, but just taking that time out each day for you can be really helpful. So I guess I'll turn it back. Dario, I don't know how much time we have left.
Yeah, I think we have probably 6 or 7 minutes left, Dr. Wagner, and I think it's probably best spent answering some questions. I think they're all great questions. Most parents have other children as well. So I'd love to tackle this question by Brittany, and that is, how you are able to attend to your other siblings and not feel guilty about the attention given your medically complex child and feel like you're meeting your responsibility as a parent for your other children.
Yes, so that's a question that we hear a lot, and it's definitely something that families really struggle with. And in the literature, we have quite a bit of information telling us that caregivers, while they understand that they attend to the child that's medically complicated, their other children, are also having needs, and kind of how do you balance all of that out? And, it's a tough struggle. I mean, I'm not going to lie, as most of you have experienced. And so within a family, sometimes you can kind of think about, are there times when you could spend time with the other siblings? Sometimes the medically complicated child isn't able to go out and do all of the things that the other family members are. So are there times that you could, have one-on-one time? And I will say that for kids, 5 minutes of one-on-one time is a lot. To us, it doesn't seem like very much, but if you have 5 minutes of one-on-one time with a child where you are really just tuned into them, no phones, no other things going on, whether it's talking, whether it's putting a puzzle together, whether it's, reading a book, whether it is painting, any of those things, kids will really just eat that up. And 5 minutes to them is the same as 30 minutes because it's you, and it's you giving them that one-on-one attention. So I would say, see if there are ways that you can even just spend 5 minutes with a child, and scheduling that 5 minutes so that everybody in your family knows, this is my 5-minute check-in with Jonah today. That's my older child. This is my 5-minute check-in, with Jesse today. And then everyone else in the family learns to respect that time. And so sometimes if you can be a little bit structured about it, that can be helpful too. And that being structured about it doesn't take away from the validity of it. Kids, because you have to schedule it, they don't care as long as you spend the time with them. So I would suggest maybe trying some of that, and as well as just validating that it is a very difficult struggle with that. And as a sibling of a child, growing up, it was tough for me at times because my parents weren't as worried about me and things were going really well for me. And I used to resent them at times for that. As an adult who now has 2 children of her own, I can understand that your kids have different needs. You allocate, different things to what your kids need. And I was never going to say anything as a sibling because I thought at the time, well, that would make me a horrible person, right? Like my brother's really struggling with epilepsy and I'm complaining because my parents didn't ask me what grades I got on my report card that year. So there's a lot going on, with siblings too. And just, like I said, that 5 minutes of time is super important. And even just asking your kids, how are you feeling about this right now? And giving them the space to say how they really feel about it can be helpful. Even if you can't change the situation, just acknowledging that in your kids can be very helpful too for them.
Dr. Wagner, another question that we hear often, and I think Christy asked this one, is, how do I make it okay with myself to take time for myself when I know my child is struggling and or being challenged and or has, this battle on their hands? So can you speak into that a little bit for us? Sure.
Yes. As a caregiver, it is very difficult to take time aside for yourself. Especially, as parents and caregivers, we would do anything for our kids, absolutely anything. And so it does feel selfish to take that time for you. But what I would say is it's not at all, because again, taking care of you puts you in a better place to be a caregiver, to address your child's needs. So if you think about, like, you know, if you, let's say, because one thing I hear a lot is parents like, I just get so frustrated and then I lose it, right? If you take 5 minutes of time for yourself and you have those ways to manage the stress in your life, whether it's yoga or journaling, then you will be less likely to respond out of frustration. You will feel like you have more energy to be able to address the things that your kids need. So, you know, don't think of it as a selfish thing. Think of it as taking care of you is actually going to help your child do better, because it is.
Thank you. Another question was asked, Dr. Wagner, about those who are looking for potential mental health support through a therapist. You know, what should someone look for in a therapist, and what's the best way to go about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really, in some ways, depends on where you are. So, I mean, the American Psychological Association has a directory of psychologists. There are lots of mental health professionals. You can have advanced practice nurses, you can have PAs, physician's assistants, you can have psychiatrists, you know, so there's lots of different types of mental health professionals. But the American Psychological Association does have a list. You can type in, it's like find a provider, and you can type in on their website where you are and see that listing. You know, I recommend asking the epilepsy provider if they have any recommendations, because sometimes it's not necessary, but it can be helpful to have a mental health expert who has expertise or training in epilepsy, or at least in populations of kids that are medically complicated. And this goes for anyone, autism, you know, whatever, because that person's going to understand a little bit more about the disease and what all that entails and what that might be, you know, for the family. But not everybody lives in an area where those experts are readily available either. So you can also ask your primary care physician or provider. You can, sometimes different states will have on their state licensing page, they will have lists of providers in their area. So there's lots of different ways to find it. I think what you're looking for is, you know, it's nice to have that recommendation from someone else, because I'll be honest, just like in anything, there are really great providers and there are not so great providers. And, you know, what I always hate is when somebody doesn't have a good experience with mental health and then they don't want to go back. So trying to find out if there's someone in your area that would have a recommendation, whether it's a friend or, you know, the epilepsy or primary care provider might be able to help you with that and help kind of narrow down what that would be. So that's not a great answer. I wish it was like, all you have to do is go to this website, type it in, and boom, there you go. But it's not quite that easy.
Yeah, and just to reiterate what Dr. Wagner said earlier, I put my email in the chat, and if we can point you in the right direction or provide more support other than these conversations and the resources we're providing here, please feel free to email me. Reference in the subject line, caring for caregivers, and I'll certainly respond. And I want to get to two more questions, Dr. Wagner. Gabe asks, how do you acknowledge the feelings your child has about the medically compromised sibling and not make them feel wrong if they come from a selfish perspective? What a question, Gabe.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, you know, what's important to think about with kids is that when we're encouraging them to express their feelings, some kids will just tell us exactly how they feel. Other kids might hold back, especially if they're concerned about you and the response that they think that you might have. And so you might explain to your kids, there are no right or wrong feelings, right? It's what you feel. And you can validate someone's emotion. Like, I understand that you're feeling really upset about this and that you think that it's unfair that we have to spend so much time, with your sister. I hear what you're saying and I understand that. What can we do to help with this? So it's really important to validate their feeling, even if it is a negative one, and even if it is selfish. And not to call it selfish or to add another label to it, but just to repeat what the child says and say, I hear what you're saying. What can we do to help with that? Is this something that you would like to talk with us about, or something you'd like to talk with someone else about? Because I hear what you're saying, and I don't want you to have to keep that stuffed inside. Kind of back to what I said earlier too, about when we keep things inside, they're there, even though nobody else knows it. And speaking it out into the light allows someone else to help you with that and to help connect you with what resources you might need. Because we're going to have the feelings that we have, whether we share them with someone else. And when we do share them with someone else, it just invites the chance for someone to help us process that instead of keeping it stuffed down inside.
Thank you. And I have a question that I'll ask for myself. How do I talk to, my children about my own mental health? And I have two older kids. My autistic son's younger than the two older ones. And I have found it's easy for me to talk to my older kids about that, but my younger one still picks up on the energy, still picks up on the anxiety, and or if I have some kind of reaction to something that's out of the norm, he really picks up on that. So what's the best way for a parent to talk to their child? Obviously, I know it's age specific, but just general guidelines on how a parent can share mental health in a way that a child doesn't personalize it, and also in a way that gives permission for the child to be aware of his own or her own mental health potential challenges.
Sure. Yeah. So that can be a difficult balance as a caregiver, deciding how much to share and not share with your kids. And you're right. Kids are very intuitive, and they watch their parents, and especially the kids who don't have a medical diagnosis, they grow up in a family learning to watch the parents and the parents' response. And are my parents okay today? They learn to watch their sibling, and are they sick today, or are they having a hard day today? They tend to be fairly intuitive about those things. And so, I would encourage parents to definitely talk about mental health, not necessarily your own, but mental health in general. And kind of back to what I was saying a minute ago about sharing things and providing those safe spaces and validating how your kids are feeling. I think it's helpful to share that lots of families of kids with autism, epilepsy struggle with these same things. So validating, the mental health pieces of this, both for the caregivers and for the child. But what you want to refrain from doing is asking your child to support you, right? So letting them know, yes, I'm having a hard time with this right now, but I'm doing X, whether it's I'm seeing a therapist, I'm going to a support group, I'm talking with my friend about it, so that they know that you have a plan in a way to cope with that. You're not asking that from your child, but you're also letting them know, because kids don't like it when parents say, I'm fine, because they can tell you're not, right? And so you want to be truthful in the sense that you want to let them know, yes, I am having a hard time with this, but here's what I'm doing, because you don't want a role reversal where you're asking the child to then take care of you.
That's such an excellent point. And I want to thank you so much, Dr. Wagner, for your insight, your transparency, your vulnerability, your experience, obviously as a sibling and as a professional. And I really want to thank you for the role that you've played in planting this seed for Christy, myself, our medical advisory board, and the entire team, including Dr. Aldavo is on the call. She's a licensed social worker. She's now trauma-informed therapist. So we have that resource that we can offer as well. And I want to acknowledge her role in support and working with our families. But thank you, Dr. Wagner, for your support and for the insight and your expertise. And with that, I'll start to bring this meeting to a close. But before we close, I'll ask everyone if you can just list a couple words about how this meeting, how you received the meeting in the chat, whether whatever that is, positive, negative, any kind of description you'd like to use, because it'll help us as we learn to provide to your needs and be more responsive. Our next Zoom meeting will be on November 28th. That's also a Monday at the same time. The same link will be accessible. You'll be able to access this meeting, that same link. And on behalf of our medical advisory board, the families that we have the honor of advocating for, and the entire community of parents who are caregivers to medically complex children, we hear you, we see you, we feel you, and we're here. My email is in the chat. Our website is mickiesmiracles.org. We have a resource page that is up now that you can visit. As we put up these recordings, you'll have that to access year-round. But if you need support, please talk to someone. If that one is us, we'd be honored. If it's someone else, that's okay too. These conversations are necessary, and by giving ourselves permission to have them, we remove the shame, we put it out in the open, and we are able to connect to more resources to not just care for ourselves, but provide an environment that is more conducive to our children developing as well. With that, thank you. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you for all your support.